Alrighty, folks. Seems like we're getting a good signal right now. Uh, just gonna. Yep, time looks good to me. I'm here to introduce Rob Chaney. Rob Chaney has this event, and then he will be closing out the panels of the festivals on Sunday with Where Humans and Wildlife Meet. It's going to be a great time, but we're glad to have him here to help start off the festival. So, Robert Chaney is managing editor of the Missoulian newspaper, where he's been a journalist since 1997. His environmental reporting there formed the basis of his first book, The Grizzly in the Driveway. He is currently working on a second book for the University of Washington Press on our relationship with nature as reflected through Glacier National Park. Give it up for Rob.
Well, thank you all. I really appreciate everybody coming out for this on the early part of the festival, because that's in the middle of the week. And is this carrying enough? All right. I wanted to start with just a short reading, because I know some people are here for book craft, and some people are here for bears, and some people are here because they just like books in general, and I'm happy to talk to all three. But there's a part in the book that really encapsulates one of the challenges of putting a book together like this. And that's the chapter that I called The Bear on the Bicycle. And it starts off, "Oh God, bear." Bradstreet's penultimate words were his cousin's only warning. The two men were on a mountain bike ride on the Green Gate Trail just across Highway 2 from Coram, sandwiched between Glacier National Park and the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex. Treat led, pedaling with competitive effort, about 60 feet ahead. He whizzed around a blind corner. Then came a thud, followed by an animal's roar of pain or surprise. 2 seconds later, the cousin came around the same corner and saw a large grizzly bear standing over Treat's body. Treat called his cousin's name twice, his final words, which were not included in the coroner's report, leaving the cousin unidentified. The second man stopped his bike about 30 feet away from the crash, uncertain what to do. He described the bear as brownish black, very big, with bristled up fur. The bear focused on Treat's body, never looking at the companion. After about 30 seconds, the cousin decided he had no chance of pushing the bear off the scene, so he turned around and rode for help. When he could hear the highway, he dismounted and carried his bike through the brush to flag down a passing car. It took roughly an hour for him to reach a phone and call 911. It was June 29th, 2016. The Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee Board of Review analyzed the impact scene in clinical detail. Treat's demise took just sweeps of a second hand. The investigators estimated he was pedaling about 25 miles an hour when he saw the grizzly. The tire tracks on the trail showed no signs of braking. Treat plowed into the bear so hard he made a horizontal bruise on his chest where he hit the handlebars. His biking shoes were clipped into the pedals, so his momentum flipped both him and his bike over the bear's body. Treat flew into the ground hard enough to break both wrists and shatter his right shoulder blade. The grizzly responded with its paws and claws, mauling Treat's head and shoulders and shattering his bike helmet. It also bit him, but the post-mortem reported only mouthing bites or test bites to see if the victim was still a threat. The bear didn't do anything else to Treat's body. Didn't move it, didn't cover it like a grizzly bear did with Lance Crosby's remains in Yellowstone National Park. Didn't do any of those things that bears do with food that they plan on caching to eat later. It vanished. Montana State game wardens set 2 culvert traps and a network of remote cameras to learn if the grizzly remained in the area. Over the next 48 hours, they got nothing, except for one neighbor's report of seeing a large black grizzly near her driveway a mile and a half away from the incident. The suspect was never seen again. Which stands to reason given what we know about that bear. Thanks to the genetic analysis breakthroughs discussed in Chapter 5, there's a surprisingly large amount. The crash left 12 samples of bear DNA on Treat's bike and body, mainly hair and saliva. Forensic analysis revealed the matching grizzly had been trapped in Glacier National Park's Camas Creek drainage in 2006. Because it was a male and the biologists were looking for females, they did not collar it, but only recorded its biometrics and let it go. At the time, it was estimated to be 8 or 10 years old and weighed 370 pounds. The DNA signature showed up in the hair traces found in the grizzly census effort 5 more times around the Coram vicinity over the years. But the bear itself stayed out of the logbooks. It didn't threaten livestock. It didn't cruise garbage dumps. It didn't challenge hunters for kills. It did get spotted occasionally, including a probable encounter just half an hour before it killed Treat. A Swan River Outfitters guide was leading a string of dudes on horseback about 800 yards away from the crash site when they saw a large brownish-black grizzly bear ahead of them. The grizzly charged within 6 feet of the group before veering off, making noises and snapping its teeth. Between 1998 and 2011, DNA hair snares revealed at least 6 male and 3 female grizzly bears using an area within a 3-mile radius of the crash site. Radio collar records showed another 5 males and 5 females traveling the same area. Grizzly bears like this one live 18 or 20 years only by strict adherence to ursine self-discipline and good fortune. The sheer number of temptations and threats, bird feeders, freight trains, picnic baskets, 5-lane freeways, hunting camps, and research labs packed into the southwest corner of Glacier National Park give a bear little chance of avoiding some kind of human interaction. Chris Servine had barely retired from his career-long post as grizzly recovery coordinator for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service when he got asked to lead the Board of Review into Treat's death. It was Servine's 8th such postmortem since he took the job of coordinator in 1981. He released his report on March 3, 2017. Quote, with something like mountain biking, the high speed and quiet nature of riding increases the probability of encounters with bears when you're coming around blind curves, Servine told me. In the case of Treat's collision, he said, here's a bear that's 20 years old, who's lived in a high-density human area his entire life. He's pretty skilled at staying away from trouble. We think he was just as surprised as Mr. Treat was. The two of them probably had only 1 or 2 seconds before they encountered one another. After the initial 48-hour search and trap deployment, state game wardens stopped trying to catch the suspect grizzly. They concluded the bear didn't threaten human safety despite just having killed a human. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service biologist Wayne Casworm had just replaced Servine as interim leader of the grizzly recovery effort. Treat's death crystallized one of his top tasks, getting people to agree on how much safety they all must give up to coexist with bears. They're wild animals, and we are not controlling them, Casworm said. What we attempt to do is provide information so people can make reasoned judgments about what is safe activity or not safe activity. We're trying to get some conversation going, to get people thinking about what's going on out there in the woods. To deal with objective dangers in the outdoors, people are already self-limiting their recreation in many ways. Boaters avoid rivers during spring runoff or accept the consequences of lost gear, wrecked boats, possible death. Golfers voluntarily leave the links when a thunderstorm brings lightning over their metal clubs and their spike shoes. Snowmobilers and backcountry skiers check avalanche forecasts and weigh the risk of the day's adventures. We're trying to get folks to recognize and take on responsibility for their own safety when they walk into known grizzly bear habitat, when grizzly bear habitat is taking over more and more of Montana. Casworm told me, when a bear results in a human safety issue or it's killing livestock repeatedly, we remove the bear. But if you're tooling around on your mountain bike and you bump into a bear and you're scared, that's not necessarily a reason to remove the bear. Is it a reason to remove the bikes? And what about everything else humans like to do in bear country? Whose interests rule? 3 years to the day after Treat's death, Flathead National Forest Supervisor Chip Weber declared his disagreement with Servine's report. New controversy had arisen over a commercial ultramarathon and a backcountry bike shuttle service in the national forest land around Whitefish, Montana, about 20 miles from Coram. I want to start by strongly repudiating the notion that as an agency we ought not promote, foster, or permit activities because engagement in those activities presents risks to the participants, Weber told the Interagency Committee. The issues around this are much broader than trail use, and grizzly bears and both people and wildlife may suffer if the discussion isn't expanded. As for the Board of Review report, Weber told me he had great personal respect for Servine, but Servine's, focus is grizzly bear recovery and solely grizzly bear recovery. Mine is serving the American public and the needs they want in the context of many wildlife species and overall conservation mission that's very broad. I'm going to jump ahead here a little bit to two other voices. Swanview Coalition Director Keith Hammer, who had been fighting Weber over the ultramarathon and various other grizzly activities, lives a few miles south of the Green Gate Trail where Treat was killed, and has spent most of his life trying to protect grizzly bears. Most of that time has been spent fighting people like Servine and Caseworm, who Hammer considers too intent on scoring a delisting win for endangered species to consider what he thinks the bear really needs. Protection from mountain bikes is high on Hammer's list. I've hiked my whole life, he told me. I mountain bike. I have never been charged by a black bear or a grizzly while hiking, but I've been charged twice on a mountain bike. The first was by a black bear with 2 cubs. She was in front of me, and she charged. And then she went back and got her cubs out of the trees, and that was the end of it. But last summer, he trailed off for a moment. You run into bears near streams. It's good habitat, plus they can't hear you coming. I'm biking, and it's quiet, and the next thing I hear a woof and a growl and those lungs huffing in and out. I've heard lots of bears, usually going away from me. This was following me. Nothing feels more stupid than having both hands on the handlebars where you can't grab your bear spray. The only way to deploy it is to stop, and you can't stop. It's different on a road. You have good lines of sight. It's riding on trails that's the problem. I've worked and played and camped in bear habitat. If I want to live longer, I need to quit mountain biking. It ain't rocket science. Summer Treat, Brad's wife, took a very different approach on the 3rd anniversary of her husband's death. In a public letter, she fought, quote, fought against any association or focus with an agenda, clear or subtle, that would attempt to limit recreation on grizzly bears on public land. 2 weeks after Brad's death, Summer Treat started riding the same trail where the accident happened. She said she's done so every day since. Quote, I run in the woods with the bears because I still can. I saw a grizzly bear last week on my morning run. I felt a fantastic tingle inside my soul, the feeling of knowing I still get to experience this. Let me be clear. This magic, tingling feeling was at the core of Brad's existence. It defined his professional life and how he spent his personal time on public lands. The final perfect moments of Brad's life were spent doing exactly what he believed in. I picked that section for a couple of reasons. One is just last week I got interviewed by a New Zealand podcaster whose podcast is Armchaired and Dangerous. And it looks into sort of the fringe, crazy parts of life in the United States that New Zealanders find fascinating. And a lot of it he wanted to know about, grizzly bears, grizzly recovery. But at a certain point, we had to drill back to, and then tell me about the time the bear got the guy. And it's like, okay, we're bear porn. But that's what they wanted to know. The other thing, and this is a book craft issue, for those of you who have written a book, and I'm a daily journalist. I have been for the last 30 years showing up in the morning and usually sending something out the door by afternoon, tied up in a bow and edited and sent off. Writing this was a 3-year process, and the week before I was to send the final draft, Summer Treat pops out of the woodwork with her letter. And, you know, you'll stop the presses on a book, but I did. And we shoehorned Summer Treat into the story because I think it should be obvious. Her perspective is essential to the conundrum that we all face about living in grizzly bear country. And that gets to the title that I gave this book, The Grizzly in the Driveway. That came from, again, an insider book business. Most authors don't get to pick their titles, I found out. That's done by the marketing department. And the marketing department really wanted the grizzly on the trampoline. In reference to a Facebook post that I had found of a woman in outside of Browning who had grizzly bears showing up in her yard and snoozing under her children's trampoline. And she was furious that nobody was going to come and chase the grizzly out of her yard. But we couldn't get rights to the picture, and it was this grainy Facebook post, and the grizzly on the trampoline just sounds a little bit too weird. But as we're arguing about this, serendipity, another person in that same area had posted a complaint about there was a grizzly bear in Many Glacier Campground, and the rangers came in and they fired off the cracker shells and they chased the bear out. But that same week, a grizzly showed up in her driveway, and it was her problem. This grizzly was a known radio-collared grizzly named Monica, I believe. And she wanted to know how come they weren't going to shoot Monica or otherwise get rid of her, solve her problem. This same week, across the Continental Divide in Condon, was another grizzly bear that everybody had named Windfall. And this bear was wandering around through everybody's garbage and chicken coops, and everybody was out with their cell phones, Facebooking it to show the grandchildren how cool it was that we have charismatic megafauna in our backyard, and they loved Windfall to death. Windfall got so accustomed to raiding garbage that she became human food habituated, and Fish, Wildlife, and Parks had to send a team in and kill her. And the community, 27 members of the community, wrote a letter of apology that they had let Windfall down. Sorry. Gets choked on things. So 2 grizzly bears in the 2 weeks in 2 driveways sum up the problem of what is a grizzly bear. Is it a boogie monster in the back of your memories and nightmares from the night of the grizzlies, pulling you out of your tent and crunching your bones in the middle of the night? Is it Yogi Bear in the picnic baskets? Is it, a thing that you see out the car window as you're driving over, going to the Sun Pass or through the Lamar Valley? Is it a biological part keystone species of a giant ecological food chain that may or may not be influenced by our incursions into that process? All of those different things wind up in the same ball of fur and claws and blood that makes up an animal roaming around in sometimes our backyards right here in Missoula. They're here now. And we got to figure out what to do about it. But how we do that is all tangled up in what we think a bear is. What bear is in the driveway? What monster or charismatic megafauna or spirit animal or economic pest are we dealing with? And that has led to my next project, which is just trying to figure out our relationship with nature. Is it something like a terrarium that we got levers and knobs and control? Or is it an agent in itself that is looking at us like a mole on your arm that, I think we might want to cut that out? And I will leave it at that and see what you want to talk about. Please.
So you've done so much research into all the different facets of this. I was Rob's editor for a while, so I know. And it's so impressive, but did that lead you to come to a specific opinion? Because you were very cautious about not voicing one. But do you have a way you think we ought to go with it? Or would you rather?
A friend of mine asked me, how do I sleep in grizzly bear country? And I do. I know many friends who can't. It's too frightening. They can't get the nightmare out of the back of their head, and it's no fun for them. It's not worth the trauma, the anxiety of having that in the back of your head. I keep wrapping it up in, I also like pizza. And, when we had the Missoulian office right over here, we had the Bridge Pizza right across the street. And we have had more people killed on that intersection in the last decade than we've had killed by grizzly bears. And I walk across that thing 3 times a week for pizza. Humans are terrible at judging risk. The chances that you are going to be yanked out of your sleeping bag in the middle of the night by a grizzly bear and crunched are infinitesimal to the things that you take for granted every day around drunk drivers and mistaken construction, and not to disparage these guys out here, but walking into open manhole covers in the street. So I find that an acceptable risk, and I find it as a policy matter a risk that we ought to accept as a public lands manager, that there are things out there that will kill you off if the odds come up wrong. Deal. That's my personal take on it. Whether that has any impact on how we build a grizzly bear policy, I have my doubts. Please.
Adding to that, Rob, was the question of your personal view of the mountain bike situation. Just seems like everything that is taught or tried to teach about ethics around bears, making noise, making sure they know you're coming. It's just antithetical to the way it is for mountain bikes. So I guess hearing that, it makes me really question whether we should have any mountain biking in active grizzly bears.
That was the other reason I picked that chapter, is because once again, right after we hit run on the press, we get e-mountain bikes for hunting. You can go down to Shields right now, and for $3,000, pick yourself up a camouflaged e-bike. Now, there's several layers to this. One is the legal one, is the Trump administration passed a rule saying in all national parks, if you allow bikes, you allow e-bikes anywhere those go. But within the national park system, that varies, because you've got places like Moab, Arches, Canyonland, where they are wildly tolerant of biking through the slick rocks. And then you got Glacier, where you are on paved trails and nothing else. So there isn't a solid standard within the national park system. Add on to that the wilderness rules of motorized, non-motorized. What is an e-bike? Is it a motorcycle? Is it a bicycle with assistance? Are we all the bionic men and women now? It's the proverbial camel's nose under the tent, working its way in. The other level of that is when you artificially enhance human performance, then a whole bunch of people who otherwise would have self-selected not to go places start going there. The snowmobile community has been arguing about this for decades, that, why should Grandpa not be allowed to go back to his favorite place anymore just because he needs a snowmobile now? If he's not able to snowshoe or cross-country ski, why can't he take a snowmobile in? What's the difference? Well, I hate to use the slippery slope argument, but we have for people who are paralyzed, we're building exoskeletons. For people who would otherwise be wheelchair bound, they've now got things you can strap to your legs and you can march along. What's to say you need to be paralyzed? What if you just got bad knees like me? At what point do we start saying, no, you can't be enhanced to go further? And then there's the third level of things, and that is the competence issue. When you have that many more people who are able to go that much farther into what used to be untracked territory, then our influence on the way back, the last remaining really isolated places where a grizzly bear can be relatively certain of not getting into conflict, suddenly become conflict zones. But we created that. The bears, it's one thing if the bear moves into the rattlesnake. It's another thing if we move into the deep Bob Marshall. And again, part of me, my personal view is you take the risk, you die if necessary, and don't expect me to send 2 Bear Air helicopter after you to haul your butt out. Again, I don't think I'm in the majority on that opinion, but there we are. It's got a December deadline, which is getting a little panicky. But it's looking at a bunch of things that came up during the bear book about how we decide to fiddle with nature. One of them is fish. There's a place in Glacier Park right now where artificially introduced lake trout have eaten all of the native fish up in the northwest corner. They have worked their way up the Flathead River, and every lake they can get into, they have extirpated the native trout species. In Logging Lake, they have cleaned it out, but above Logging is a little lake called Grace Lake, and there's a 30-foot waterfall between the two. Grace Lake is now a piscatorial Garden of Eden. They have captured the last breeding adult bull trout out of quartz and hauled them in buckets and dumped them into Grace. Is that okay? Under what circumstances is that okay? Do we need to be trying to save the bulls, or do we just deal, as Emma Morris would have us, in a rambunctious garden? Invasive species are species too, and we just may have to let the thing roll. That's one. Bison are another way of looking at this thing. The Blackfeet Indians on the reservation side are planning to reintroduce and defense huge bison herds and say, you belong here. We have a cultural, ecological, and economic tradition built around the existence and the free ranging of bison. They are legally wildlife. Therefore, there is no fence necessary. Fly, be free. That includes flying being free across the Canadian border, because there are Blackfoots, long story, on the northern side who are doing the same thing with their bison herds, and they're planning on turning them all loose and telling the federal governments in Ottawa and Washington, D.C. to go pound sand if they don't like it. Glacier, namesake, 25 and shrinking. What are we going to do about that? Do we save glaciers? Do we readjust the climate to preserve the status quo as we have it, or try to hold back the impending sea level rises and temperature changes and chaotic weather patterns? These are choices, and I do not have answers, but I want to get the questions on the table and actively discussed really fast. I'm actually now talking with a bunch of doctors, particularly cancer doctors, trying to get the vocabulary for how do you manage a progression that is metatastically going out of control, or at least accelerating and becoming more and more chaotic as you are trying to get your hands on it. The way that somebody in an end-of-life situation, if you were trying to keep them alive and one organ after another keeps failing or one new tumor starts growing, what's the heuristic for dealing with that? Is there one? And then the fourth and fifth are fire and us. We are, investing millions, approaching billions of dollars a year trying to control fire. And all of us here in Missoula are probably neighbors with at least one fire scientist or experienced firefighter whose personal work situation would argue that we're really not playing this game with any sort of competence. And then the final thing, coming back to the bikes, is us. And what do we think should be the limits or the opportunities we grant or impose on ourselves? But the whole bigger question is, where does nature fit into all this? It's a particularly Western cultural idea that, to go biblical, go forth and dominate the world. Farm it and harvest it and bring back the fruits of your labors, or you're not doing it right. There are a lot of other traditions on the planet that have a very different perspective on that, and I'm trying to bone up on those right now as quick as I can because, again, if we don't get them into the conversation at least, we might not have time to finish talking. Please.
You spoke a little bit before about the difference between doing daily journalism and turning in articles, and what the process of the book was like for you, and I'm wondering if you can touch on.
Yeah. The real joy of daily journalism is what they sometimes refer to as you're the first draft of history. You go somewhere, you write down what you saw, you come back, you write it again with a little more grammar and punctuation, and you send it off. When you put it between covers like this, you're expecting that somebody somewhere time-wise, 6 months, 6 years, 60 years down the road is going to pick it up and go, boy, did he blow it. Where the hell did that flat earth idea come from? Or, gee, he didn't realize that electricity was a thing. You think a lot more globally about the idea that you're going to commit to that page because it's not just going to become fish wrapper the next day. So it's a little intimidating to try to do that, to build the argument. As part of the reason why you fall back into things like, I'm just asking the questions. Because my answer is going to get blown out of the water by the meteor or something or other that comes later on. But it also gives you a chance in a very different way, in a very different kind of long-form argument to air out ideas and kind of see where they go in a way that daily journalism I can't do. Just because of the time pressures and the rush of getting from here to the next thing and moving on. Does that help?
Absolutely, thank you.
I've appreciate, I think, different, put the different views in the book. Like when you first read about the mountain biker hitting the bear, and your first response is, of course we should keep the mountain bikes out. That you put his wife's thoughts in there. And I've experienced the joy of mountain biking, but it's like, just a place where everyone goes mountain biking on the Cleveland Wood up there. It's flat, it's easy work. It's a thrill. It's just love it. And I understand a little bit that passion. So I'm glad you showed both sides, although I have a tendency to agree with what they do with zero visibility. But it's such an easy answer. It's people needing their joys. They're awesome.
It's also, a perspective thing. Missoulians have the Rattlesnake Wilderness a bus ride away. You can ride a city bus to a wilderness boundary. Whereas, I got to spend some time in Boston a couple years ago, and part of the reason I went was just to immerse myself in a big urban center and see what people thought of that. And you realize that, wilderness is the sycamore tree growing out of the sidewalk, which is where you hang your bird feeder, so that you can see critters. And in Boston, what's the name of it? There's a gigantic cemetery that I'm blocking on the name of right now. And it is kind of the closest thing to nature run amok that I could find in Boston. Walden Pond, our example of living in the wild is a little lake ringed with houses, and Thoreau's little cabin is sort of bunched together with a whole bunch of other people's cabins. There is not a whole lot of solitude or untrammeled experience there. Mount Washington up in New Hampshire, which is the windiest place on the continent. You stand on top of that and you look around, and it's wilderness. It is federal wilderness, and you can see the edges of all of it. And as somebody who grew up stomping around in Glacier Park and the Bob Marshall, and knowing that I could get so lost that it would take days for somebody to find me, that it would take days to ever see civilization again. In fact, we did the math once. You can, from that bus stop, walk to the Arctic Circle and cross 5 roads. If you string it right. That's how far you can get from civilization out here. That's a long ways away from the sycamore and the sidewalk. I would need that exoskeleton. But the point being, we have a very different perspective because of where we live. We are 66 times more powerful voters than, for example, anybody in California. And that's just perverse math. But our access to John Tester and Steve Daines and Matt Rosendale is immense compared to a Californian's access to Dianne Feinstein or Nancy Pelosi. And percentage-wise, just the number of people it takes to elect a U.S. Senator in Montana, or 1 million people, compared to California with 66 million, we rock. We have asymmetrical power and influence over these public land decisions. So what we choose to do with our congressional delegation and our legislature is asymmetrically powerful to the rest of the country as well. And that's something to kind of keep in mind when we think about whether or not we should vote. we have unusual influence here.
So when did your book come out? When did that book come out?
That came out officially in January 2020. No, excuse me, January 2021. In the middle of COVID, when nobody noticed. I apparently had just kind of got into the publication queue before COVID shut everything down, so it was able to actually get sort of delivered. But then we went into the asterisk zone that we're finally coming out of now. So I really appreciate the Montana Book Fest folks for letting me to have another bite at the apple.
Has anything evolved since you, because I'm not all that aware, has anything evolved with all of that, like the issues like you guys, since you wrote it, where you were writing more now, you were...
It's a constant avalanche. Since I wrote it, the three governors of grizzly bear country, Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, have all petitioned the federal government to delist the bear. That happened just after we went to press. They are all petitioning for a bear grizzly hunting season, again, just after we went to press. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service made its recommendation to not delist the bear mainly because of those decisions, again, after we went. And then we had the Ovando killing and the West Yellowstone killing, which, again, at a certain point, that's just more bear porn. But at another point, it's, another way to think about the boogie monster in the back of your head. The Ovando was a particularly complex incident because that's one of the very, very few actually go into the tent and attack somebody in the middle of the night. Ultimate night of the grizzlies. What the hell just happened? And there's a lot to study in there. There's a lot to figure out and interpret, and I'm not even certain if we are done and have any good lessons to draw out of that yet. It has always struck me, again, and this is a risk management question. If you're worried about, bringing food into your tent, and I'm not disputing the rule that you shouldn't do it, but if you're worried about bringing food into your tent, you are food. You're a down feather wrapped burrito in a tent. Giant meat sack of protein there. And if you think that the bear is going to pickpocket your Snickers bar, I'm not sure we've actually worked that out in a anthropomorphically accurate sense. On the other hand, she did appear to have food in there. The bear did come at it twice. That was very bizarre behavior. Maybe there were bizarre bears. Maybe, as a gambling book I have pointed out about rolling dice. He once saw somebody roll in craps 23 straight passes. And the odds of that happening are something like 1,000,000,000 to 1. But he says, if you calculate how many dice games are going on every day around the planet, the only thing amazing about it is that you happen to be there to see it. Because it probably happens at least once a day. So, do we draw any lessons out of Ovando, or was that 1,000,000,000 to 1? It wouldn't matter what you did or how many times you went to church or whatever. The lightning bolt was going to get you. I don't know. Thank you all so much.